Thanks so much for coming to the session. My name is Dan Mogulof, and I'm here today in my capacity actually as a former journalist, meaning I don't really need to know anything, I just need to ask a question. And I'm here with Ari Kelman, who's going to introduce himself in just a second. The name obviously is Israel in the Minds of the American Jews, and I think it's particularly apt given what the theme for our gathering is today, In Search of the Shared Dream, because we're going to be talking about data, for the most part data around a relatively recent survey that Pew did, asking American Jews a wide range of questions about identity and their connection to Israel and religious affiliations. But what was really interesting is a couple of years later, I think in 2015, they went and asked Israelis pretty much the same questions, and at the end we'll talk a little bit towards the end, we'll talk about where the answers were very similar and where there were huge divergences. And sort of, I think leading to some questions about there may be a shared dream, but the dreamers are very, very different when they go to bed at night in terms of what's important to them and how they view themselves in terms of their Jewish identity. So much so that when the Washington Post wrote a story about these two opinion surveys or polling efforts of American Jews and Israeli Jews, they said, quote, American Jews and Israeli Jews might be characterized as brothers from different planets. So that's quite a step away. I mean, we heard today earlier about the fact that maybe it's wrong to think of ourselves as part of a family, and here at least one interpretation of the data say, well, we might not even be planetary neighbors. But anyway, without further ado, I'm going to let Ari introduce himself, and then we'll go from there.
So my name is Ari Kelman. It's great to be here this afternoon. I teach in the Stanford Graduate School of Education. I'm a social scientist. I study American Jews. I'm not an expert in Israel or Israeli policy. I am something of an expert, at least fairly well informed about American Jews and their behaviors, both historically and contemporarily. I take a very broad, so we're going to be talking really about American Jews and how American Jews think about Israel, at least what the data tell us. We're not going to be talking about Israelis because I don't know anything about Israelis, or the state of Israel to speak of. I teach in the Graduate School of Education, which means I train people to do research on education, which means I also do research on education. I don't train people to be Hebrew school teachers or day school teachers, but together with my students, we're working on a couple of projects about B'nai Mitzvah, about Jewish life on college campuses these days, which is a big issue, and a few other things. So that's right.
There you go. So we will save time at the end for questions, so it's not just going to be me, thank God. But what I'd really like to do, Ari, is start to sort of capture, in the context of why we're here today and what we're talking about, what did the data tell us? What did we find out about who American Jews are these days, and how they see themselves, how they identify, and how they connect to Israel?
So I'll give you this picture in two phases. I'm glad you asked. I'll give you the picture in two phases. The first is going to be more sort of cultural and impressionistic, and the second is going to be more kind of hard data driven with information drawn mostly from the Pew report, which, as Dan mentioned, came out in 2013. If you live or work or pay attention to Jewish communal life in the United States, you have doubtlessly heard some kind of sermon or talk or something about the Pew report. We're still coming it over to try to make sense out of it. So I'm going to share specifically findings from that report as it pertains to how American Jews think about Israel. But first I want to start with culture. I come from a background where I study popular culture, and I think popular culture has a lot to tell us, and often popular culture changes more quickly, or at least introduces ideas more quickly than politics do. So I have 3 books that come from leading lights of American Jewish literature. First is Leon Uris's Exodus. Show of hands, how many of y'all have read that book? And seen the movie? Basically the same thing. They take about as long to get through. So 1958, Michael Chabon's Yiddish Policemen's Union. Show of hands for readers. So 2007, and then Here I Am from Jonathan Safran Foer, which came out like 2 weeks ago.
Which one?
Here I Am.
Here I Am?
Just came out.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Just came out about 2 weeks ago. So has anybody had a chance to read that book yet? All right, I'm gonna give away part of the story, but not the ending. So Exodus, I'll give away the ending. Written by Leon Uris in 1958 in collaboration with the government of the young state of Israel. It was a heroic story of Ari ben Canaan, after whom I am not named. who leads the hunger strikes on the ship Exodus that's trying to make it from a DP camp in Cyprus to then Palestine, British Mandate Palestine. Ari Ben Canaan, in great sort of kind of spy guy fashion, tricks the British and helps helps to start the war that became the War of Independence. It's a massively heroic story. The movie version and the book version both follow fairly common American sort of refrains of the frontier story. Some people read it as a kind of cowboy story, where like a Western where Palestine stands in for the American West, which always stands in for images of the future, of possibility, of newness and things. And it was really did a huge job, the movie in particular, but the book as well, translating the story of the young state of Israel in kind of popular narrative terms that American Jews could understand. And everybody read Exodus, and everybody loved Exodus, and everybody referred to Exodus. And it was very clear that the future of Jewry worldwide lay, at least to some degree, in Palestine and then in Israel. Michael Chabon's novel, The Yiddish Policeman's Union, came out in 2007. The conceit of that book is somewhat different. Chabon imagines that the Jews have lost the war of 1948, and that as sort of compensation, they're given an independent Jewish state in Sitka, Alaska, where the lingua franca of that place is not Hebrew but Yiddish. And this is a detective story, sort of magical realism. I mean, it's magical realism already. Kind of magical realism set in Sitka, Alaska, and then translated into English from its original Yiddish. So already in 2007, you have Michael Chabon, who had just, the book before this was Cavalier and Clay, which won him the Pulitzer Prize. You have the leading American Jewish novelist writing a book where he fantasizes that the future of Jews or the past of Jews is not in Palestine or Israel, but is in fact in Alaska. It's not in Hebrew, it's in Yiddish, and it's not in a warm place, but is in a very cold place. So all of which are total divergences from the classic Exodus narrative that really has defined, I think, American Zionism in many ways. 2016, Jonathan Safran Foer, again, one of the leading lights of American Jewish literature. We can have a different conversation if he is the leading light in the way that perhaps Leon Uris was or Michael Chabon was. That's for a different session. In any case, this book was highly anticipated. One of the cruxes, so it's about a family in the United States that looks, not surprisingly, like the Foer family, and because all of his books have that sort of thing going on. And there's an Israeli relative visits him in the United States. There is, during that visit, there's an earthquake in the Middle East that precipitates an attack on the state of Israel, and because of the earthquake, the Israeli cousin and the protagonist of the novel are literally stuck in the United States, unable to do anything. They try to get back, somebody also passes away, they're trying to get his body back to the state of Israel to be buried. So they literally cannot get back to the state of Israel, not the Israeli, not the dead man, not the American Jew. They literally can't get there, they're stuck. And so I think that the evolution of these narratives about America, and you could throw Philip Roth's Counterlife in the middle if you wanted to, the evolution of these narratives from a kind of pioneer spirit vision of Zionism to a sense of being stuck in every way, I think captures the narrative arc of American Jews' changing relationship with the state of Israel. How that plays out in terms of politics. So I like to talk about that for people for whom numbers are like not your native tongue. For those of you who are more comfortable with numbers, we're now going to go through a lot of them, so bear with me, hopefully fairly quickly, because I actually would rather get to the conversation. So one of the big questions is how attached are American Jews to Israel? How close do they feel to the state of Israel? And I want to look specifically at three ways in which this breaks down: age, religious affiliation, and political leaning.
Before you begin, can I just ask, are these, the data you're going to be showing us, are these just right out of the Pew Report?
These are straight from the Pew Report.
Are they available?
Yes, they're all online.
If you Google the phrase Pew Jewish American 2013, you'll find both the Pew Report sort of summary of it, and you'll find the whole report and the top line and the raw data and everything.
So it's not extra massaging that you've done by doing crosstabs on different things?
No, you can find versions of these tables that I'm going to show you exactly as I'm reproducing them almost exactly. I've narrowed them down and cleaned out some of the clutter that's not germane to our specific conversation, but the numbers I'm showing you are straight out of that, unadulterated. I didn't run any additional analyses or regressions or anything, straight up, which is going to prove limiting for those of you that have more complicated questions. I'm warning you. So attachment is the name of the game. What attachment is and what it looks like, there's a bunch of different ways that social scientists try to measure it. But most social scientists agree that attachment is something that is worthwhile, at least in this endeavor. So the first one is age. Or sorry, we'll do politics first. They asked, so these are sort of crosstab analyses, which is across the top you have people's self-report, this is all self-reports, people's self-reported political leanings. So Democrat leaning Democrat, Republican leaning Republican. Net Jewish across the board. If we just look at how everybody who was surveyed answers this question, Democrats are 70% of Jews lean Democratic, 22% lean Republican. So Jews, as they have been historically, strongly democratically oriented. So the majority, I show this first because it's important to understand, some of the numbers I'm going to show you later have slightly different pictures, but the vast majority in terms of sheer numbers, 70% of American Jews identify as Democrats or leaning Democrats. 22 Republican, and the others are like independent, independent party-wise, and independent as in like all bets are off them. But that alone accounts for 90% of people. Yeah?
Can you speak up to the metro area? Because that.
Which metro area are you talking about?
I'm curious to see how that would be with the New York metropolitan area versus.
So the Pew study was a national study, which meant that they have a good sample nationally, but they don't have great samples locally. There was a really good study done of the New York metropolitan area in 2011, which you can find if you Google New York Demographic Study 2011. And these data, or similar data, are going to be in there. The San Francisco Jewish Community Foundation just launched a study of the San Francisco Bay Area, all 11 counties from Santa Rosa down to San Jose. That project is just getting started, and we'll probably have data. I'm on the team doing that project. So we're just getting started, and we'll probably have better data like a year from now. So it's hard to know how it breaks out regionally, but it's a good question. I'm going to ask if you have other questions, even though I'm like totally into questions. We can just break for questions if you want to do that right now, which is fine with me. But if you want to get through the basic data, then give me like 7 minutes. I'll blow through the data, and then I'm happy to get to all the questions. I've been in too many rooms of Jews where if I say like, yeah, ask me questions whenever you have them, and then like we don't get to the stuff. So if you hold on, that'd be awesome. Can you hold on for me? Awesome. Okay. So, but if you break down the net Jewish by religion, so about 20% of American Jews say they're Jews, but say they don't have a religion. It's not that they're like secular Jews. They say I don't have a religion. If you ask them, this is a complicated thing that I can talk about at a different time, but it's not an issue today. But if you Jews by religion, 68% are Democrats, 24% are Republicans. Jews of no religion, 78% are Democrats, and only 12% are Republicans. So Jews of no religion are slightly more than Jews of religion to lean Democratic. They tend to be more liberal. This probably makes sense to you, which is good. Good sociology should make sense. But I want to highlight this, which is that among the Republicans, and this may speak to the New York question, a little bit, Jews by religion are twice as likely to identify as Republican than are Jews not by religion. So this is an important, this square in particular is important for our purposes, and I'll get to exactly why in a second.
In the church, you can talk to the mic.
Sure. That I'm happy to do. Okay. With the mic set up, oh, sure. With the mic set up, it felt like me and Dan should sing folk songs. That too would be a different session, perhaps. Not as well attended. In terms of American denominations, how American Jewish denominations break out, here's the pie chart. The one, Reform is still the biggest American Jewish denomination or movement, depending on how you want to call it. Reform is 35%. But American Jews that say they have no denomination, which is not the same as saying you have no religion, you just don't have a denomination, is about 29%. So they're the second, people who have no denomination are the second biggest denomination in the United States. Conservatives about 17%, Orthodox about 10%, everything else is about 9%. And then if you lay religion and politics on top of each other, you get this. So up top, that first line should look exactly familiar, 22% lean Republican, 70% lean Democratic. But among the ultra-Orthodox, let's see if this works. Yeah. If you draw a line between the ultra-Orthodox and mono-Orthodox, and what I would consider the sort of liberal strains of American Judaism, conservative reform and no denomination, you can see a clear break in the political alignment there as well. So the percentages of Democrats shoot up from 37% to 64%, and the Republicans drop in half from 56% to 27%. So where you see an emerging correlation between religious identity, religious affiliation, and politics. You're beginning to see some clustering happen. That there is a close, that religion and politics influence one another in ways that I think are probably going to be predictable for you. The attachment question looks something like this. If you break it down by age, I'll do that. The younger you are, the less likely you are to articulate an attachment to Israel in response to a question that goes something like, how close do you feel to the state of Israel? And then you're usually given a score, 7 very close, 1 not so close. And then you can line up in the middle. But younger people express much lower rates of attachment than do older people. That's the pattern. You can read the pie chart, but you see the upward slope to the right of attachment. If you break it out by religious grouping, again, by denomination, and I clumped for the purposes of cleanliness, ultra-Orthodox and modern Orthodox, you see a pretty sharp downward slope. That is, Orthodox people express much higher senses of attachment than do conservative and Reform people, and much, much higher senses of attachment than people with no religious denomination. The last one looks like this. This is if we do it by political alignment. Democrats and independents, Republicans, right there, tend to express, that corresponds to people who self-identify as being very attached. So Republicans tend to express higher levels of attachment than do Democrats or independent, people who identify as independent politically. So again, we're seeing that Republican religious cluster happen around senses of attachment to Israel. So there's the difference right there. U.S. support for Israel, one of the questions the Pew report asked is, how do you think America, not how is America doing, how do you think America is doing? Those are very different questions. How do you think America is doing with respect to supporting the state of Israel? This is a lot of numbers. I'm going to highlight just 2 columns. So one is Republicans. So only 1% of American Jewish Republicans said that America is too supportive. 66% said not supportive enough. Whereas if you contrast that, among modern Orthodox, American Jewish modern Orthodox, nobody said America was too supportive, and 64% said that it wasn't supportive enough, 35% said it was just about right.
So I want to actually interrupt you here with a question, sorry, to bring in age and generation, because that's one of the things that really jumped out at me, in that in terms of Jewish identity, for example, what they call the greatest generation, 1914 to 1927, Jewish by religion, 93%. Right? 93% of them identify as Jewish by religion. But when you look at the millennial generation born after 1980, only 68%. So some of this, if you look in the future, then when you overlay that correlation between Jewish identity, religion, political leaning, support for Israel, where are we headed?
Well, sociologists are really bad at telling the future.
Give it a shot.
No, I'm that bad.
But if it continues, if that generation continues, those attitudes continue.
The only pattern that I think is really going to be telling in the future. So the interesting thing about the fact, so the Pew report, one of the headline findings in the Pew report is that 20% of American Jews say they have no religion. And the Pew report really made a big deal out of it. And if you look at other religious denominations, Catholic, Protestants, Hindus, Buddhists, etc., the numbers of people who say they have no religion are rising quite sharply since about the year 2000. But in the 1990 National Jewish Population Survey, and pretty consistently ever since, the numbers of American Jews who say they have no religion has stayed consistent at about 20%. I imagine that people are going to answer a question, do you have a religion, at different points in different periods of their lives, which is probably what accounts for that. So I'm not worried about the age effect over religion. The one sort of demographic data point that suggests something that is going to be indicative of the future is fertility rates. American Jewish ultra-Orthodox Jew people have the highest fertility rates of any ethno-religious group in the United States. It's about 4.3%, 4.3 children per family in American Jewish ultra-Orthodox communities. Latino Catholics, which have the next highest, are about 3.6%. Liberal American Jews are not at replacement levels yet. They're about 1.9%. 1.9 children per household. Latino Catholics are about 3.6 children, but American Haredim are up around 4.3%. So that means that for every 2 American, and I'll dumb the numbers down a little bit to make it easier for all of us, for every 2 American Jewish ultra-Orthodox people who are of childbearing age, and they tend to be of childbearing age younger than non-ultra-Orthodox American Jews, of childbearing age, there are about 4.5 kids under the age of, say, 18. For American conservative reform no denomination people, there are less than 2 kids under that age. So, particularly in New York, this is going to, in 20 years, radically reshape the Jewish population of American Jewry. It's going to radically reshape places like New York and the north side of in Chicago. It's going to have probably less of an effect here in the Bay Area just because we don't have a large population of Haredim here. But it's going to really reshape those communities in ways that I don't know how to predict. But it's going to look really different. And the question is always, well, if these patterns stay consistent into the future, then something is going to happen. But the good thing about these patterns for people like me is they never stay consistent into the future. They're always changing because the facts on the ground change. So,
Got it.
okay, cool. So another question to ask is, how many people believe that the state of Israel is given to the Jewish people by God? So 67% of American Jewish Republicans, that's the blue cell up there, 67% of American Jewish Republicans say that it was given by God. That's 2/3 of American Jewish Republicans believe that the state of Israel is given to the Jewish people by God. 81%, not surprisingly, of ultra-Orthodox, but what is surprising, 90% of modern Orthodox people surveyed by the Pew Report said that it's given by God. And then it drops off quite significantly, as does belief in God after that. But that struck me as quite surprising. And if that's your basic position, that this chunk of land was given to your people by God, that is going to elicit a number of commitments sort of that I think are more or less predictable.
It's state of Israel, not land of Israel?
I think it's the land of Israel, because the state of Israel no one would think is given by God. And probably the reason the ultra-Orthodox are lower than the modern Orthodox is there's a significant number, at least in New York, of non-Zionist ultra-Orthodox communities, so they're going to bring that number down somewhat. But yeah, I can get you exactly the wording if you want. It's the land of Israel, not the state of Israel, sorry.
Is your third column a don't know for the answer to the question?
No, it's they don't believe in God. So don't ask somebody who doesn't believe in God if something was given by God. It's going to mess up the rest of the columns. Yeah, so there's 2% of ultra-Orthodox people that don't believe in God, which is interesting. There's probably a margin of error.
Maybe it's I don't believe you're asking this question.
No, it's don't believe that. That's right. How many people believe that the two-state solution is viable? Like, if there's a real possibility still on the table? You'll see the numbers among Democrats. I think that's my first circle. Yep. The difference between Democrats and ultra-Orthodox Jews, and you remember ultra-Orthodox Jews cluster under the Republicans. So Democratic-leaning American Jews think that about 70% of them think that the two-state solution is still a possibility. Among the ultra-Orthodox, that number drops down to 26%. The really interesting one here is that one. If you have no denomination, you are most hopeful about the possibility of a two-state solution.
And it's asking about viability, not desirability. Yeah.
Correct. Is this thing even possible? It's not. Is it a desirable solution? As far as I know, if you didn't ask that question. Do you think that the Israeli government and the Palestinian leadership are sincerely doing what they can to bring about peace? Only about 38% of American Jews, that's the blue cell, think that the Israeli government is sincere. That only looks good if you compare it to the way they feel about the Palestinian leadership. But 38% is not it's not a strong mandate, I think, if you can say that American Jews have a mandate. But it's not a lot of backing from American Jews. There we go, there's the breakdown though. Among Republicans, you get 62%, among Democrats, you get 32%, so it's about half. And remember that about 3 times, Democrats outnumber Republicans by about 3 to 1 in American Jews.
So I have another question for you. So is this correlation of politics and attitudes about Israel and Judaism, is that something new?
No.
So always been that kind of division?
It's always divided up. I mean, Jews have always leaned more liberal since easily the early part of the 20th century. They've always aligned strongly behind the Democratic Party since Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in office. And that's pretty much been the pattern ever since. And it has been typically that the more religious you are, the more right you lean. And the sociologist, or he might be a political scientist, Robert Putnam, who teaches at Harvard, he wrote Bowling Alone in 2000, which is a book that got a lot of play. He wrote a book in 2010 based on a national survey that he did a few years before that called American Grace. And his argument in American Grace was basically, and I think it's really compelling, that religious people of all denominations, so Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Hindu, Muslim, whatever, are more alike as religious people, kind of generic category of religious people, than are the conservative and liberal wings of any particular religion. So that a religious Jew is going to share more sort of their worldview with a religious Christian, with an evangelical Protestant, say, than they are with a liberal Jew, and ditto with a kind of politically progressive evangelical and a religious evangelical. And I think these numbers bear that out, at least in terms of Jewish. So sincerity and belief. So, and the modern Orthodox again are sort of among the most committed to Israel throughout the Pew survey. That was the.
We'll save that one.
Say that.
So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that jumped out at me. You know, for example, and there are things I think that we've all heard before. When you look at the millennial generation, far less likely to identify Jewish as religion, far more likely to intermarry, far less attached to Israel, far more likely to be critical or less supportive of Israel. So when you step back, I mean, and I know you don't want to predict the future, but what do we make of those generational differences, and is it a cause for concern for some of the things that brought us here today?
I don't know if it's a cause for concern depending on where you sit. So I'm going to talk as much as I can.
Yeah, please.
I'm going to talk as much as I can about the data, which is, younger people. So I can scroll that one back up. There we go. Younger people are much less likely than older people to describe themselves as attached to the state of Israel. The reasons for this are kind of, I think, fairly obvious. That if you were born, say, in the 1950s, and you're over 64, you're over in that far left column, you had an experience of Israel that was informed by the Six-Day War, that was informed by the Yom Kippur War, Entebbe and so on. And if you were born in 1990 or 1980 even, your entire experience of Israel is, the template for that was set by the Lebanon War. Very different war, very different situation. And I think so they lack a kind of historical connection to that place as a place described in books like Leon Uris's Exodus. Is it a cause for concern? It depends how you sit politically. Yeah. I think definitely the shift is on. Right. And it becomes a matter of, the shift is on. I think there's no question in my mind. You throw in families that are constituted of Jews and non-Jews, that are Jewish families, and the shift is even greater. So I think that for sure, that is probably a trend that is not going to abate anytime soon, at least not kind of under like natural sociological circumstances.
Yeah. So when we spoke on the phone last week, you also suggested that the data indicate there's been a breakdown in consensus, meaning that if we had looked at data like these, perhaps in years past, there would have been more uniformity.
Yeah,
Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, Leon Uris, like Exodus was like the consensus book for decades. And now I just think that the proposition for most American Jews and what they see of Israel behaving in the, well, it may, so let me preface this by saying, the rationale behind this breakdown may or may not be about politics explicitly. I did a study in 2005 where we looked at this distancing stuff and we found a correlation between age, much as was found by the Pew report here. Another set of colleagues looked at very similar data and came up with a slightly different story, just to be totally transparent. They read it somewhat differently. But we both found the same finding in 2005, which was that there was no correlation between one's avowed political position and one's sense of attachment to the state of Israel. Neither of us found that, and we disagreed about everything else. So we're pretty sure that that's right. The years since, in the United States at least, have seen a really vociferous entrenchment of positions and an almost pathological inability to engage in conversations about the state of Israel across those positions. Dov Waxman's book, Trouble in the Tribe, which came out last year, I think, does a really great job of documenting this phenomenon and what he thinks the impact of this phenomenon is going to be. And now we are in a position where American Jews, not having experienced the birth of the state of Israel or the victory in 1967, look at what they know of Israel either from a birthright trip or from the news, and say, why do I need this headache? And we're now in a position where American Jews can, it may or may not be an explicitly political decision, that is, but they would look at it as not aligning with their values, and they would say, why do I need this? And so they walk away more so than they sort of stay engaged in the conversation. And that, I think, is a lot of what's happening here. Not attachment is a funny measure, and so I want to be clearish about what we mean here. People who are actively involved in J Street would be defined by our measures as significantly attached. They are politically engaged, they are committing lots of hours and time, they are reading a lot. Probably Jewish Force for Peace, similarly, very attached. They are engaged in the conversation. The people who are not attached are people who are saying, I have no skin in this game. So detachment, the opposite of attachment, right, looks like, is not in and of itself an articulation of a political position with respect to the state of Israel and the actions of the government there. They may have political valences in there, but it's not the same as taking a radical critique of the state of Israel.
So with one of the other things you told me where, I mean, you said outright, the data aren't pretty, that there are a lot of indicators here of disaffection.
Sure.
And so if you're somebody who cares about the future of the American Jewish community, I mean, what do you do? What do you do with these data? What's the writing on the wall for you?
I think you have to look at the data squarely and soberly. And if you're somebody who cares about the state of Israel, then the data are not pretty. If you're somebody who is an American Jewish leader and you believe that it's possible for American Jews to have commitments to Jewishness that don't revolve around or include the state of Israel, then the data are neither here nor there. But the data they're pretty unflinching, and the agreement is pretty strong. And so if you are somebody who cares a lot about the state of Israel, then you have to look at younger people who are making significant lifetime decisions, who are figuring out their own lives and their relationship to their parents and their relationship to perhaps their children, and really try to figure out how and why Israel would fit into that picture on their terms, because they're not willing to just accept it sort of right or wrong. That is not language that resonates, I think, well with millennials.
Right, so I'm not asking your personal opinion here, but do these data also suggest that the American Jewish community needs to become more capacious in terms of its ability to sort of accept all sorts of different strains of thought and attitudes about Israel and think more holistically about?
I think that's a different question.
Go ahead.
That would, to me, seem like a question about American Jews, like, generally.
Yeah.
Whereas, so I would say, probably, is my answer. But if the question is specifically about what to do about Israel for American Jews.
That's what I meant, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Please.
Probably.
Well, you wrote an editorial about this in the J recently.
I did. Well, the editorial I wrote in the J was it was advocating that position. It was saying that if you're an American in the American Jewish community, you should be able to. Our community ought to be strong enough to withstand significant and sometimes severe differences of opinion, and I stand by that for sure. And if it's not, then that is a canary in the coal mine, because if you can't have a community that is represented by a diversity of voices, in which those voices are showing up and claiming a stake in that community, and you can't handle that, that's a bad scene.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like Jenga, right? You pull out one of those bricks and the whole thing is going to come down, kind of thing.
And what concerns you most about these data, about the story they tell? One of the things when we talked earlier, what do you think when you go to bed at night? You consider these data and consider the future. The
data don't worry me. I live in a world of data, so I'm more curious about them, and I tend to data that I like, that is to say data that I think are reliable, not data that tell me a story that I'm fond of, but data that I think are reliable. The hard part is really looking at those data and saying, here's a reliable story that's being told about a group of people or groups of people, and if I'm someone in the Federation, or I'm somebody at a Jewish day school, or I'm a rabbi at a synagogue, this is a picture of the people in my community. So what do I do with And I get asked all the time, like, how do we get young people, I was in a town in the Midwest, which was like, how do we get young people to come to our Jewish X? And you can fill in X, right? JCC, synagogue, federation, whatever, school, whatever. How do I get young people? Well, here's what your young people are saying. And so the question for me is, if I'm ahead of one of those people, is like, this is what my people look like. So how do I create a community that's going to serve all these people? And it's really hard. And I have a great deal of respect for people. My job is really easy because I just get to like ask people questions and they tell me things and I make charts like this. And then I hand it off to people who work in synagogues and schools and federations and Hillels and so on. And they have to go out and actually come up with ideas that are going to try to grab as many of these people as they can, Israel or not, like it doesn't matter. That work is really hard, and I have all the respect in the world for people who undertake that, provided that they do it in an informed way, and that's where I think this sort of like scholarship and practice partnership really is great, because I can say like, oh no, your people don't. Like, I was talking to somebody recently, and they had made this sort of Shabbat-ish kind of app, and they called the app Friday, and it like turns off your phone for Shabbat, whatever. Anyway, they got some pushback that they shouldn't call it. Why would they call it Friday? Friday, they should call it Shabbat. Right? Shabbat's our word. Don't call it Friday. And the person said, no, like, we did a lot of interviews with millennials, and the millennials were like, if I saw an app called Shabbat in the App Store, I would not download that. Taking a day off, Friday, like, that's good for me. So you have to listen to your community, and if your community looks like this, then going on with the same, like trying to sell Exodus to this community, it's probably not going to work.
So, yeah, I'm going to throw it open to questions, then I'm going to wait for the slide that does the comparative data between the Israeli communities and the Jewish communities, but let's start over here.
He had his hand up from way
sorry.
before he was
Okay, well, you answered my question before, but now I have another question. So looking at this right here that you spent a lot of time with, if we look at the age 64 plus, the very attached and the somewhat attached adds up to about 80%. And you look at the 1829, 3049, if you add up the very attached and the somewhat attached, it's about 60%. So you're looking at 80%, 60%. Is that really a number to go crazy about it? 80 versus 60?
It depends who you are. Some people say that anything short of 90% is not a good thing. I would say that the issue here is not so much the raw numbers, but the trend. And that is particularly in a community like the American Jewish community, where people ages 18 to 29 are not showing up they're not joining synagogues, they're not joining JCCs, they're not joining museums, they're not giving federation, they're not showing up. The trend toward disaffection is significant if you are concerned with Israel as being one of the places where you think that young people ought to show up to. Yeah.
Ted Sasson at Brandeis has a somewhat different take on attachment versus engagement. Do you have an opinion on his work?
I do.
On that concept specifically?
I do.
Explain to little people who may not be familiar with the discourse.
So Ted Sasson, remember before when I talked about the other scholars that disagree with us? Ted was one of those scholars. And Ted, whose work I hold in really high esteem by and large. Ted has an idea. Ted wrote a book called The New American Zionism that came out a couple years ago. That tried to make the argument that things are fine, that attachment is basically kind of, that we've seen a shift kind of from he kind of likens attachment to questions of membership. It's really easy to be a member, but it's harder to be, show up and do stuff. So tell me if I'm getting this mostly right. Attachment is kind of like a low-level measure, and he really wants to talk about engagement, and he says that the new American Zionism is really based on kind of one-to-one commitments and a real experience of the state of Israel that is different than it was, say, for people ages 64 and over, because so many more younger people have been to Israel and spent time there. Is that fair?
Yeah.
I think he's wrong. And here's why, basically. This is going to get wonky for a second. Bear with me. He doesn't give a lot of data in his book for why that is. And when you title a book with a new XYZ, you really have to show me that it's historically new. And he doesn't really do that in the book. So I'm not totally sure either that the engagement, attachment, sort of the distinction there is one that is super interesting or rich for me. Yeah.
I was interested in the side that said Democrats and people of no denomination were felt 70% optimistic that peace was possible. two states are possible, but that no denomination felt the Israeli government was sincere was like 27%, Palestinian leadership was sincere 14%. The question being, how do you make those two stories go together? On the one hand, optimism about the fact that two states are viable, but on the other hand, a pretty low level of trust that any kind of efforts to bring peace are sincere.
That's a good question. One way to read that would be to say that, so people who have no denomination tend, on the whole, to be like less involved altogether. So one way to read it is to say like that their reading of the possibility of two-state solution is the reading of people who are not terribly well informed. That anybody who's better informed would, be appropriately bleak. And if you're sort of vaguely paying attention to the news, it is not hard to get the impression that also no one is trying very hard. So I think that's probably the way I would read those two things.
Do we have over here in the back?
Yeah, so this is a snapshot, right? And at least part of the discussion assumes that opinions don't change with age. What would it look like if we looked at the 18 to 20, 18 to 25 or whatever, today versus 18 to 25 10 years ago versus 18 to 25 20 years ago?
So what you see, and this is part of what Ted Sasson has done, is you see that the numbers among younger people tend to be more liberal than older people on all kinds of movement. And so you see greater detachment among younger people pretty consistently, and in some areas it decreases over time, so you get greater attachment with age. And in some ways you don't see that. So it's a little bit unclear as to whether or not it's what we call an age effect or cohort effect, right? People who were born in that same age range as you hold the same opinions over time or not. I think we are usually, with respect to Israel-Palestine in the United States and in the minds of American Jews, like we are always on the verge of brand new territory. Because the historical conditions are changing so quickly. That is to say, if you surveyed 18 to 25-year-olds 10 years ago, even 15 years ago, 10 years ago, let's say, the nature of political discourse in the United States now is really different than it was 10 years ago, and the nature of Jewish communal discourse around Israel now is really different than it was 10 years ago. And so I think that those conditions probably also are influencing this, and they may change over time. But my hunch is they're probably not going to change all that much. I mean, I think about same-sex marriage in a similar way, where it's possible to just say that 18 to 25-year-olds like all in favor of gay marriage because like we're all, everybody's liberal at 18 to 25. But actually, we're seeing that those opinions are sticking because the historical conditions around the nature of homosexuality in our culture have changed also. And so I think we're seeing some of that same thing with respect to a sense of connection to the state of Israel. And that when we do see disaffection, Yes.
This is about the reference you made earlier to Friday. There's been a lot of publicity about new Jewish non-synagogues, large institutions that are not traditional synagogues, but do a tremendous job of getting younger people in particular to come into participation. One of these is in San Francisco, and I had just read, in the last couple of months, that one of the things they did is their entire web presence is devoid of Jewish symbols. And I've been on their website many times, never registered with me. I'm 60, didn't notice it. There is no seven-branched menorahs. There's no Stars of David. There's nothing on this website anywhere that has a Jewish symbol. But they said this has been tested in some way to be necessary. And I wondered, that sounds like the same kind of thing you said, where Friday has an appeal, because that's not specifically a Jewish word. Is that data consistent with things you know about?
I don't know. I mean, I think I know what you're talking about, the specific case I'm in. I haven't looked at that website, so I don't know. Probably, but that stuff goes back to B'nai B'rith, in 1843. Like, the desire to create a non-religious arena for American Jews to socialize. So you got B'nai B'rith and you got Hadassah, they were like Jewish Masons, and they adopted all kinds of stuff from the Masons, and they were not into the seven-branch, candelabrum, and they were not into stars, like, they may have used the Star of David, but these sort of patterns recur over time where there's more and less comfort in addition to reach out in a new way with what are seen as kind of traditional Judaic symbols. So I'm not sure it's all that new. It's cool.
I'm just wondering how much of this is,
You're not gonna call on me.
how much of this is a uniquely Jewish issue, and how much of it is just, again, the dissipation over time? Like, I'm assuming if you go back 50 years ago, you know, first generation Italians settling in New York had this deep connection to Italian. Now, if you ask the great-grandchildren, I think they say, I like a few things, or like Irish people, I like St. Patrick's Day parade, and that's my Irish identity.
So the
you know?
difference between those things, so there's a bunch of studies that sort of run those things up against each other, because the migration patterns are basically the same for Jews, Irish, and Italians. Jewish. The difference is that Irish and Italian people actually came from Ireland and Italy. Jews, by and large, did not come from Israel, because then we'd be right. So they came from Poland and Russia, probably. So their relationships to the quote-unquote homeland are really different. And as a result, that does all kinds of wonky things. Moreover, Jewish ethnic connection has retained in a way that Irish and Italian ethnic connections haven't retained over time. So Irish and Italian intermarriage patterns, such as they are, like they're probably upwards in the 90%, you know, whereas Jews, you know, it's about 50%, still holding strong. So it's a slightly different animal when you line it up against those other two groups, even though their sort of time from immigration is the same. And even though they immigrated at the same time, Jews did things that were really communally and educationally and professionally really different than the majority of Irish and Italians. So as a result, they also started looking different quite early. Yes, you had a question.
Ma'am, did you want to?
Yes. In regards to the BDS presence on campuses, specifically at Berkeley and Stanford, throughout the Bay Area, and all of California, the U.S. and the world, is your study that you're talking about doing with the San Francisco and the other Jewish federations going to ask Jewish students on college campuses how they feel about the presence of BDS?
So that is slightly off the center of this, but I can say that the answer is both. With respect to the study that I'm doing with the Federation, probably not, because it's not that kind of study. With respect to this, I'm doing another study with my graduate students, one of whom is sitting right here, of Jewish students on college campuses in California. That is very much at the that issue is very much at the forefront of it's driving that study. We are asking it in a slightly more open-ended way, generally speaking, but the answer to the question is, yeah, give us about a year, we'll get back to you.
So I'm just going to interrupt just for a second. So one of the things we also talked about, and I think it's germane to some of the questions that come up, and you stated pretty clearly to me that Israel no longer, the data say that Israel no longer means what it once did for American Jews. Are there more things you want to know about that? Is that something that we can probe deeper in terms of understanding why, or the answers to the why question there in the data already?
They're not in these data, because the data didn't go that
Are they in other data from other surveys?
Probably at this point, although sampling is always really challenging, so you want to find the right people who are going to ask the question to give you a good read. Because if 31% of American Jews overall say that they have no connection to the state of Israel. So if you want to know why people are sort of quote, walking away, you're going to want to reach out to those people to ask them, because they're the ones who know the answer. But it's likely that if, say, I'm APAC, and I'm concerned about these people because I think they're a potential sort of growth area, and I say, hi, I'm from APAC, I'm here to ask you some questions, that person may not want to answer my questions. So it's tricky. I think the data, I don't know if the data are out there. They could be out there. I think that's the question that a lot of people are asking. Pew didn't
They didn't really go there, did they?
They were asking a lot of questions about a lot of things.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you've ever been at home during dinner and the phone rings and someone on the other end of the line says, hi, I'm from a polling firm, or we're doing this study, it's really hard to say, sure, I have 20 minutes to answer a question. And then to ask lots of deeper questions about whether it's Israel or family structures or educational levels or whatever, right? It's just like,
yeah,
you really have that person for 15 minutes.
Yep.
And so P was really going for the big picture.
Yeah, I cut you off here at the
How about data from birthright? How is that made the younger,
So-
18 to 25, more attached?
It's a good
And
question.
have
So-
they done,
Yeah, so Birthright has been really good about studying its own applicants and participants. And if you go on Birthright, you are a certain number of percentage points more likely to express an affinity for the state of Israel. The interesting thing, though, is when you run the Birthright, and Birthright, like methodologically, they're pretty good. If you run the Birthright data against these data, and Birthright accounts, by the way, now, Birthright is a program that will give a free trip to Israel to anybody 18 to 20, any Jewish person 18 to 26. Birthright accounts for about half of all trips to Israel for people under the age of 35 at this point. And if you run those data against these data, they still don't have the net effect of changing the data in really hugely significant ways. There's a bit of a bump, but I think about Birthright in the same way I think about, they're like quantitative easing, if that phrase means anything to you, where the government sort of infused back in like 2009, the government infused the economy with cash basically to alleviate the pressures of the economic crisis. So Birthright is a little bit like that, sort of, it's introducing a kind of artificial stimulus into the economy, if you will, of Jewish identity that is not having tremendous overall effects, but it is having deep effects on a significant number of participants.
Thank you for the information. I was wondering, it might be a nuance, but I think from my Israeli point of view, it is worthwhile. What you describe as not attachment or no connection, would you describe it more as criticism or as indifference?
In this stuff, it's more indifference, because a critique suggests an engagement.
Yeah, sort of.
So it's more a level of indifference, where it's like, 100%, this is the secret finding of the Pew study, is that 100% of American Jews have a Jewish identity. I realize that seems totally obvious, but if you want to get in to participate in this study, you have to have a Jewish identity. You have to say, I'm Jewish at some level. And then you get to take the survey. So 100% of people have a Jewish identity. 93% of those surveyed say they're proud of being Jewish. So Jews are winning the identity battle. Like, that's good. Not only do they say they are Jewish to some stranger on the phone, but they say they're proud to be Jewish. And then the numbers like drop significantly when it comes to asking about actual behaviors. So the critique is a kind of engagement. The detachment, or sort of, forget your word, indifference is, I think, probably what it's really about.
Yeah, and I think it also is made manifest in terms of how they raise their children, right? I mean, there are huge differences in terms of how they identify with religion, whether they're likely to intermarry and likely to...
Right. Israel is, if you look across the sort of, the interesting thing about American Jews in Israel is if you look across indicators of kind of Jewishness, Israel is one of, a number of indicators. And it happens that if you don't do things like late Friday night services or give charitably to Jewish organizations or join or are a paying member of a Jewish organization, you're probably also more likely to not feel particularly close to the state of Israel. Those things, as again, kind of is predictable, like rise and fall in line with each other, which is why you have more ferocious attachment for ultra-Orthodox and sort of less attachment among people who don't even claim a denominational connection.
So before we wrap up, I just want to go to the last slide. It's really going to be more food for thought because either Ari or our actual experts in the data that came out of Israel. This is really interesting. So as I said at the beginning, Pew also, went back a couple years later after they did the American survey and asked Israelis the same question. What we're looking at up here is the percentage of Jews who say that X is an essential part of being what Jewish means to them personally. Now, really interestingly, the biggest gap is at the bottom. Israelis seem to have lost their sense of humor. As Jews. So only 9% of Israelis think having a good sense of humor has anything to do with being Jewish, whereas 42% of American Jews do. Do with that what you will, I have no idea what to make of it. Now one of the areas that's closest is that remembering the Holocaust is a key part of being Jewish. But then you start to see some other interesting divergences, and I think they relate to some of the themes, some of the things we've heard earlier in the day today. Working for justice and equality. Over half of American Jews see that as an essential part of being Jewish, but barely a quarter of Israelis do. The same goes for being intellectually curious. These are really interesting gaps, and it's, what to make of them. There's really interesting stuff written about this. So if you want to Google, if you just do Pew, American, Israeli Jews, you'll have all sorts of results. There was a lot of interpretive stuff that was written in Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Times of Israel even. But I think this goes, in many ways, this goes right to the heart of some of the things we're talking about. And I haven't seen any trends, but you can see that very different communities with very different attitudes and across some key sort of data areas that I know for many of us are essential parts of being Jewish, but not necessarily shared by folks on the other side of the ocean.
So these are Israeli Jews live in Israel?
Yeah.
This was a survey of Israeli Jews living in Israel.
Yeah.
Question.
I find it so
Yeah.
odd that like caring about Israel is actually scored less by Israeli Jews than it is by American Jews.
That's odd.
Well, they don't, because they don't identify, I think one would say they don't see that as part of being Jewish, that's part of being Israelis.
Living.
Right, so that it raises interesting questions about
They would
that
say,
dichotomy.
so on the bottom, there's a little gray thing that clears the question up. So in
Oh, that's right,
America,
sorry.
it says, the percent of Jews who say that caring about Israel is an essential part of what being Jewish is, and only a third of American Jews say that. And Israelis say living in Israel. So for Israeli Jews, that was phrased, the percentage of Jews who say that living in Israel is an essential part of what being Jewish means to them.
Yeah, that's
so
sorry.
that's why those numbers look the way they didn't ask about Israeli Jews living in Israel, caring about Israel. To be clear.
So just we have, unless there are any more questions, just want to thank.
Depressing.
What's that?
Depressing?
It's depressing. What do we do, you know, as a community? That's, you know.
I mean, American, like, I would just say, I mean, you can read it as depressing or not. It's up to you, but I think that,
You have a sense of humor, Doug.
right, if you're an American Jew, that's totally fine. I'm not sure, even though I was to go back to that first slide and sort of go back to Exodus and the Exodus narrative, which looms so large in the minds of American Jews and now even American evangelicals, in terms of what Israel is. And when you think about birthright also, it's, 10 days on a bus with other American college students where you're exposed to a very selected segment of Israeli society during those 10 days, even during the highly touted Mifgash. That is the extent to which that is an actual exposure to anything that would resemble real life in Israel is up for tremendous debate. So that Israeli Jews and American Jews reported out very different attitudes toward things like social justice or observing Jewish law, which is sort of Israeli Jews seem to think is more important, or even having a good sense of humor. It's not that surprising to me because Israel in the minds of American Jews has very little to do with Israel itself, which is part of the reason that I started by saying, by trying to be really clear about that, saying I study what American Jews think. I don't study the state of Israel. I don't study what Israeli Jews think. And so what American Jews think about Israel, in many ways, bears no resemblance to actually what's happening in the state of Israel, in the government or on the street or wherever. So these divergences, I read them and I was like, yeah, that sounds about right. We're talking about sort of two different species. What we're interested in, I think, is the species that's represented by the blue dots and what they think about the species that's represented by the light blue dots. And that, again, is a slightly different story than what Israelis really think and what American Jews sort of do.
I think one of the things that we haven't talked about in terms of interpreting the Israeli Jews' responses is that when you ask a secular Israeli what is essential part of being Jewish, they're thinking about religious Jews. They're not thinking necessarily about themselves. So you're not getting the values of the sort of secular majority. You're getting what they think of as Jewish.
It's slightly more complicated than that. The Pew study of Israelis was quite good. And actually one of the interesting things that I thought, one of the things that they found was that there's and so in American minds we think of there's religious Jews and there's secular Jews and they're in Israel and that's them. But actually there's a whole third population in Israel that they asked about who identify as Masorati, which means traditional. And so there are people who are if they're going to go to synagogue, they're going to go to an Orthodox synagogue, or they'll go to synagogue on Saturday morning, they'll go to a soccer game in the afternoon, which in the American sort of religious lineup starts making us, it's hard to deal with. But there's a huge amount. They're mostly from Mizrahi countries. And they represent somewhere near a third of Israelis.
But this says what is an essential part of being Jewish?
The phrase, and I don't know how it was worded exactly, was what does it mean to you personally? Not what do you think it means to somebody else? That would be a different question.
So we should probably wrap up. I'm sure some of you have, because the program continues on at 4 o'clock. I don't know if Ari can stay around.
4:30.
People have break.
4.
What's that?
4:30.
Oh, 4:30?
We have a
We're here
We can
until
have a
4.
few more questions and then get some beautiful Palo Alto air. And back.
Hi. Is there data on how many Jews in America America are part of the different groups like J Street or JPC or APAC or?
Only if you ask those groups, and you can take those data as you will. Yeah.
So what did you mean when you said that you thought that these data were, disassociated with what's actually happening, right? Because I mean, what I'm thinking about is the impact that an issue with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or the perception of the American Jewish community, or at least in certain parts of the community, that the Israeli government isn't doing enough to address the conflict. And it seems to me that these. And when you mentioned same-sex marriage, I was thinking about the same thing, because I was thinking about how an issue like same-sex marriage, an issue like that dramatically changed attitudes on, homosexuality in America. Like that, how attitudes on same-sex marriage, how the same-sex marriage debate evolved, rapidly changed views, right? So I was thinking, well, I wonder if, if there was a change in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, whether that could affect a significant change in attitudes, and whether young Jews on campus who now feel, the ones who were supportive of Israel feel besieged, right? I mean, you're pretty an outlier. It's inconsistent with your sense of social justice. At least that's what you're being told. It's difficult, right? And that's the environment today in which Jews on college campuses and younger Jews are living in. I mean, they're faced with an onslaught of views and information that's very inconsistent with the narrative of Exodus, et cetera, et cetera. So I wonder, so you can't really take these data and disaggregate them from the, or separate it from the context of what's going on today and the impact that this persistent, conflict has on people's attitudes and about attachment. And even when you say, they're indifferent, maybe that indifference is, avoidance of engaging because it is so difficult.
I have no doubt that some of the avoidance of engaging is because it's so difficult. But what I meant to make when I made that distinction was, I'll use this slide as an example. It's not whether or not people are actually making good efforts to making peace in the world. It's whether I think people are making efforts to make peace in the world. So that difference, if you ask somebody who's like working 24/7 to try to make peace on behalf of the Israeli government, they're like, no, we're working all the time and our efforts are sincere. Whereas if you ask, Shmuel or Sarah, American Jew, whether they think that is happening, you're liable to get a different opinion. So that's what I meant by it's different from what's happening in the real world. They're connected, of course, right. But they measure different things. If you could come up with a kind of measure of effort on behalf of the Israeli government, on behalf of the Palestinian leadership, that would be it'd be a different study than asking what American Jews think is happening over there. People are terrible reporters of their own lives. Yes?
Question. The slide before last, the data reflected the current administration, or was it an aggregate view over all administrations?
Oh, the one about if they're making a sincere effort?
Was that reflective of
this one?
I think it was the one. Yeah. I think this was the
So the study was done in 2015, or I'm sorry, 2013. So it was the Netanyahu administration. Yeah.
Okay. And do you have any plans to evaluate different mediums that affect decisions? So right now you brought up, Exodus, which is a romantic novel, but since we've had the advent of social media and other mediums that impact our decision, our different triggers. So do you have plans for evaluating, news media and other media?
I don't. Those things are very, very hard to study in any consistent manner. I would just, as a researcher, which is why I think Exodus and the Yiddish Policeman's Union and Here I Am, I don't point to them because, Exodus was a bestseller. We'll see what happens with Jonathan Safran Foer's book. But to me, those things are interesting because they crystallize a kind of a cultural moment more so than they represent the opinions of a lot of people. That is, a book like the Yiddish Policeman's Union